King Saul, that is, reigned for approximately 40 years, according to scriptures like Acts 13:21 and others. And David reigned for approximately 40 years, according to 1 Kings 2:11 and other scriptures. While Saul and David possessed some similar leadership characteristics and behaved similarly in some instances, both good and bad, overall, they were as different as the light is from the darkness. The Bible affirms no less than 3 times in very similar ways that David behaved wisely. And the Bible never uses that exact language with reference to King Saul. So the question that would come into my mind would be this: what does it mean when the Bible says David behaved wisely? What does that mean? Well, let's answer it this way. Knowledge is the ability to recall facts. Wisdom is the correct and practical application of that knowledge. Behavior deals with an individual's conduct specifically toward others. So, the Bible's affirmation of David behaving wisely means that David conducted himself in ways toward others that were correct, especially in view of the information he had and the circumstances. And, most importantly, David's behavior satisfied God. So ultimately, when the Bible says David behaved wisely, what does that mean? He pleased God. That's pretty simple. So a question for us is, do we behave wisely? What's the standard of wise behavior? Who determines whether or not we behave wisely? Well, ultimately, you know as well as I do, it's God. So tonight we're going to talk about David, and the sermon title is David Who Behaved Wisely. We'll be pretty much in 1 Samuel tonight. So first, let's talk about this. David behaved wisely in the first place toward his kindred. We'll be in 1 Samuel, and we'll start in chapter 16. First, we're going to see that David behaved wisely to his father and his brothers. So that's what we mean by kindred first. Look with me in 1 Samuel 16 and verse number 1. 1 Samuel 16:1, and the Lord said unto Samuel, how long wilt thou mourn for Saul? That's King Saul, obviously. Seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel. Means it's time to go. We got to move on with life. Fill thine horn with oil, and go, and I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have provided me a king among his sons. Now Saul had crossed the point of no return with the Lord, and it was time to discover the individual who would ultimately take his place. Now what have we learned from 1 Samuel 16 and verse 1? The next king was to come from among the sons of Jesse the Bethlehemite. Well, let's look down to verse number 10 in this chapter. And we're talking about what? David behaving wisely, and specifically toward his father and his brothers. Verse 10. Again, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, the Lord hath not chosen thee. So he went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the Lord never said anything directly to Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? Because the Lord said, look, you're going to anoint one of Jesse's sons. Well, there's 7 of them. Nope, 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 all the way through 7. And he, that seems to be Jesse, said, there remaineth yet the youngest. Now, what was the youngest doing? Now, look how David behaves wisely, because you see, it's going to boil down to obedience. And behold, he keepeth the sheep. Meaning what? He did what he was told to do. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy. When you see ruddy, it brings the idea of red. So David, it seems, had some type of a red complexion. Maybe he had red hair, but that's the idea behind ruddy. Reddish. And withal of a beautiful countenance. Countenance has to do with the face. So David was apparently a good-looking young man and had a reddish tint to either his skin color or perhaps he had reddish type hair. And goodly to look to. And the Lord said, arise. arise. Anoint him, for this is he. This is he who? This is he that's going to ultimately be the second king of the United Kingdom of Israel. Verse 13, then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. That seems to show that David was an inspired man from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now, after meeting Eliab from among the sons of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, guess what happened? It was 1 through 7. No, 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 no. Finally, and when you look back, Samuel thought right when he saw Eliab, well, that's the one. This is going to be the one. Jesse's oldest son, just from the appearance alone, well, right there he is. Guess what? Samuel was wrong. It wasn't the oldest. It was, in fact, the youngest of the 8. And what was the youngest of the 8 doing? He was out keeping the sheep. Well, let's dig a little deeper. Let's look in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Let's look at verses 17 through 20. What are we talking about? David behaving wisely, but specifically toward his kindred. What's he doing? Verse number 17, and Jesse said unto David his son, take now for thy brethren, we'll see who they are, an ephah of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Verse 19, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Now look carefully. How do we behave wisely? And David rose up early in the morning. He did what he was told to do. But he didn't forget. He already had a responsibility. Well, what was his responsibility already? Watch the sheep. Now wait a minute. Dad's told me to go do something, so that obviously alleviates me from my previous commitment. No, David understood that. David, you need to go do this, but somebody's got to be here and watch the sheep. Now, David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper. Notice that. He didn't abandon one job to go do the other. He made sure that one was covered before he went and did the other. And took and went as Jesse had commanded him. Look at that. As Jesse, who's Jesse? That's David's father, had commanded him. And he, David, came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight and shouted for the battle. Now, David's 3 eldest brothers went with Saul to battle against the Philistines, and Jesse simply wanted to know how they were doing. How's Jesse going to find out? Well, we're going to send David. We're going to send David and find out how they're doing. But look, David behaved wisely. We're going to read that several times in chapter 18. Now look, he was given 2 things to do. Some of us, it seems, can't do more than one thing at one time. Now, David knew I can't go do this and leave this unattended. So what did he do? He made sure the sheep were covered. Then he went and obeyed his daddy. Now, this isn't real hard to understand, I don't think, is it? I think we see where this is going. But David also behaved wisely toward the Israelite people. Look in chapter 18. So his kindred first was his father and his brothers, and now second, toward the Israelites. Look in chapter 18, verses 6 and 7. 1 Samuel 18:6 says, and it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands. All right, that's pretty good, but it doesn't stop there, does it? And David his 10,000s. Now, after defeating Goliath in chapter 17, Saul placed David into a position of authority. We'll see he was over the men of war, and David made the most of it because the Lord was with him. So would you say at this point that David's behaving wisely toward the Israelites? Oh, they're singing songs about him. And in fact, they're singing really higher, and they don't mean to insult Saul, but really they're singing higher praises of David than they even are their reigning king Saul. Now, look in this same chapter in verse number 16. But all Israel and Judah loved David. Now, that doesn't necessarily indicate that the kingdom was divided at this time, but it gives you the idea. all these tribes, all of Israel, all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Now, when you start to reflect upon these things, David was obviously handsome. The Bible says that. And obviously he was tough, and we'll dig a little deeper and see with regard to that. So David was just one of those guys. The men respected him, and the women loved him. Now, generally when people are like that, it's hard not to like them. But sooner or later, we're going to find a way to find a flaw in them, because somebody's ultimately going to get jealous. Now, here's the application for our life. Our application is the word reputation. Our reputation is based upon the way others think and feel about us. So at this point, how did others think and feel about David? They felt pretty positively about him, wouldn't you say? Now, here's the catch, if there is one, to reputation. The way people think and feel about you can be correct, but it could also be incorrect. But one thing is certain, isn't it? People feel how they feel, and they say whatever it is they say. What's the point? We ought to strive to have a great reputation. It's not like we want to go out and make enemies just to make enemies. Now, ultimately and inevitably, things like that are probably going to happen. But what do we need to strive to do? Have a great reputation. Don't give people the rocks to throw at you. You know why? They'll throw them. Don't give people the gas to pour on the fire. Do you know why? They'll pour it. Now, reputation has to do with what others say of us. Think about Proverbs 22:1. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. So get this in your mind. On the one hand, you have a good name. On the other hand, you have great riches. What do you choose? Well, what does the Bible teach we should choose? Does the Bible teach we should choose the great riches at the expense of our name? A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. Perhaps we'll learn this lesson one of these days. Let's move on. Let's talk in the second place about David behaving wisely. And David behaved wisely toward his king. And in this instance, we're referring to David's fleshly king, and that was Saul. Now, David behaved wisely toward King Saul on Saul's good days. Now, go back to chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. And let's look at 1 Samuel 16, verses 21 through 23. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. Saul loved David greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Now, after Saul developed his rotten disposition, and it's expressed, as we read in verse 23 there, as an evil spirit, and it's an evil spirit, really, I guess you could say, from the Lord, meaning that Saul developed a rotten attitude, a rotten outlook, and the Lord said, go ahead. If that's the way you want to feel, go ahead and feel that way. David was selected to stand before Saul for several reasons, and you can read about some of them in verses 17 and 18 of chapter 18, one of which was because David possessed great skill on the harp. Now observe that when the evil spirit was upon Saul, David went and played the harp. And some people feel like it's not really a harp, but more like a lyre. But either way, it says harp, so harp works with me. But when David played well on that harp, what happened? The evil spirit departed from Saul. Now, is that a demon? We illustrated this when we talked about Saul. Where did the apostles say, oh, we got a demon-possessed person? Which one of y'all got a harp? Which one of y'all is good at playing the harp? No. So it wasn't demon possession. It was a rotten mindset, a rotten disposition, a rotten attitude. So when Saul was having good days, David behaved wisely, didn't he? Now look in chapter 18, and this time verse number 5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and here we go. behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted. David was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now, according to 1 Samuel 14:50, Abner was what we might consider the general of Saul's army. That is expressed in the King James Version, the captain of his host. So David was placed into a position under Abner, but he still carried a measure of authority. Now, does the Bible say that David behaved himself wisely? Then there's no arguing with that, is there? We just have to try to figure out, what does it mean to behave wisely? Now, we see David behaving wisely toward Saul on his good days, but guess what? Saul was a little, what we might call, moody. Saul didn't always have good days. Saul had some bad days. Now, you think David behaved wisely toward Saul on his bad days? Well, let's search the scriptures and see what we can find. Look in chapter 18 and verse number 12. And Saul, that's still King Saul, the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel, Saul was afraid of David. Isn't that something? Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore, Saul removed him from him. Get David out of my face. Why? In this context, he's afraid of him. And made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out, David went out and came in before the people. That seems to have some type of military connotation there. And verse 14, what does the Bible say? David behaved himself wisely in how many of his ways? It says in all his ways. What about when Saul was good to him? Did David behave wisely? Mm-hmm. What about when Saul wasn't good to him? What did David do? David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Verse 15. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself, that David behaved himself, now we get another modifier, don't we? Very wisely. He was afraid of him. Now, don't you see that good or bad, especially with regard to King Saul, how did David behave himself? He behaved himself wisely. And the last time we read it said David behaved himself very wisely. Now, we're not going to read this, but in 1 Samuel 18, verses 17 through 24, we have an account of Saul's treachery toward David. Well, what do you mean by that? I mean this. Saul promises David his eldest daughter, Merab, in marriage. So Saul makes a promise. But Saul gives her to Adriel the Maholathite instead. So he's committed to allowing David to be his son-in-law, and then he says, nah, I don't think so. That's not going to work. Unsatisfied with David still breathing, Saul determines to snare him by permitting him to marry Michal, and Michal in this instance is another of Saul's daughters. Now David realizes he has nothing to offer as dowry to Saul, so Saul asks what he probably considered impossible of David. Let's see what that is. Look at me in 1 Samuel 18, but we kind of give a little bit of background. Now let's pick up in verse 25. And Saul said, 1 Samuel 18:25, thus shall ye say to David, the king, Saul's talking about himself obviously, the king desireth not any dowry, meaning you don't have to give me any animals, you don't have to give me a sum of money for my daughter's hand in marriage here, but I do want something from you. The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Now let's think about that just for a second. How are you going to go, now I don't have to go into great detail I don't think, but how are you going to get the foreskin of a living Philistine? It ain't going to happen. You're going to have to kill that man first. And Saul understood that. Here's what I want from you. And Saul realizes you're not going to walk up and say, hey, can I have this from you? And they say, oh yeah, no, that's not how that works. You're going to have to kill those men. Then you're going to have to do that. Now that's kind of ridiculous to ask of a man to do, isn't it? When you say that's a little ridiculous. But that's what the king has asked of David. Now, look at what it says. The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But what does the Holy Spirit tell us? Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Saul's thinking, he ain't coming back alive from this. He might go try, but this ain't going to happen. He's not going to be able to do it. Verse 26, and when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And the days were not expired. It seems perhaps that Saul put kind of a time frame on this. Here's what I want, and here's the time you got to get it done. David's looking at this saying, hey, I'm going to get to be the king's son-in-law because I'm going to go get this done. And I'm going to have a little help with me. See how David behaves wisely? Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men. See that? It kind of is beneficial to have friends from time to time. He and his men and slew the Philistines. Now Saul asked for how many? I want 100. David said, let's go ahead and solve this. Let's go ahead and get 200 men. And that's what they did. And they gave them in full tale the whole number to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. Now even Saul realizes, what am I going to say now? I told him, here's what I expect of you. He went and doubled it. He's already committed one daughter and then backed off. Now he's committed Michal, and he says, go get me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. David said, I got it, plus 100 more. What are you going to say to that? And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Now look at this. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass, after they went forth, that David, here it is again, David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. I find that amazing. Saul is really give this to David so that he'll die, and what's happened? It's backfired. It's backfired something awful. Now what's the application for our lives? Well, here's the word that we're going to consider, and it's the word respect. David teaches us by his life that we ought to respect and obey those in positions of authority, regardless of whether we like them or not. Regardless of whether they're good men or bad men. Saul really asked something of David that he didn't really have any business to ask him. But David said, hey, look at the bright side of this. Look when I go do this, I'm going to get to be the king's son-in-law. I've been out here tending sheep. And now I'm going to get to be the son-in-law of the king. It's amazing when you think about it. You ought to write down in the tables of your mind 1 Peter 2, 13 to 15. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be unto the king as supreme or unto governors, as them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well, for so is the will of God. I didn't write that. That with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, I'm not trying to say that we have to obey the sinful things. For example, if the civil government were to say, you get to have 2 children and then every other pregnancy from there has to be terminated by abortion. Do we have to obey that? No, we do not. But what is the general rule? We submit to and obey civil rulers. What has David's life shown us? He behaved himself very wisely. Well, what did he do? He listened to the civil ruler, didn't he? Well, third, I want to suggest 2 keys which help explain David behaving wisely. Now, on just a cursory look at this, there are 2 things that stick out in my mind. There are 2 keys, if you really want to boil it down. Here's key number 1, optimism. Think about David. Was David an optimist? I believe he was. He was told, for example, and we'll read another account here, he was told, you go get 100 Philistine foreskins, and he's not looking at, oh no, he's looking at, I get to be the king's son-in-law? This is all I have to do? Now, you talk about seeing the glass half full. Seeing the glass half full, isn't it? That's an optimist. Now, did not the Bible say that David behaved himself wisely? What does that mean? He was an optimist. Despite the disbelief of others, David believed in himself. We're going to see that very clearly. You do realize that one victory almost always leads to another, both physically and spiritually. Now I want you to look with me in David's confidence in 1 Samuel 17. And let's begin here in verse number 34. Watch. One victory almost always leads to another victory. 1 Samuel 17:34, and David said unto Saul, this is after Saul said, you can't do this. What are you thinking? David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went, now watch this, I went out after him. Number one. Now what, you didn't tell me that's not an optimistic attitude? David said, where is it? I'll go get it. I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him and slew him. Now, watch. Don't miss the point I'm trying to make. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. Now watch. One victory led to another victory, and David says, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them. One victory led to another victory to say, who is this guy? I don't care if he's 9.5 feet tall. He's going to drop like a sack of taters because the Lord is with him, right? This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord, now look, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he doesn't say might. He doesn't say I hope. What does he say? He says he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, what do you want me to say now? What am I supposed to say to that? Go, and the Lord be with thee. Don't you see? One of the keys to David behaving wisely was what? Optimism. One victory, whether physically or spiritually, what does it help us see the next time? Well, I did it once, so I can do it again. But the second key is this word, and it is obedience. The true key to David behaving wisely was the fact that he obeyed the word of the Lord. It really is that simple. Do you want to behave wisely? What's the secret? Do what God says. Now there's you got to be a PhD apparently to understand that, right? Wrong. That's not hard or difficult to understand. In this instance, let's turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 14. 1 and 2 Chronicles really are, I guess, what you could consider a synoptic with parts of 1 Samuel, but really 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. They give us the priestly perspective of really the reign, primarily the reign of David, but it does deal with Saul a little bit, but basically the reigns of David and Solomon, his son, whom we'll talk about a little bit later. But let's look in 1 Chronicles chapter 14. And let's try to figure out, why did God bless David? I'm going to present that it was very simple. God blessed David because David did as he was commanded. Again, hard to wrap the mind around that, wouldn't you say? 1 Chronicles 14 and verse 16. A little bit later in David's life, but I think you'll see the point. David therefore did, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? David therefore did as God commanded him. And they smote the host of the Philistines from Gibeon even unto Gazer. And the fame of David went out into all lands. And the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. So what are the keys? You say, well, who put this in the Bible? Well, God put it in the Bible. Well, what can we learn from it? David behaved wisely. Was David a man? Yeah. Am I a man? Yeah. Are you a person? Yeah. Can we behave wisely? Yeah. Well, what's the secret? Optimism and obedience. I can, and I'm going to go do exactly what the Lord has told me to do. Well, what's the application for our life? I believe it's this word, and it is reverence. Reverence. When we love God, what's going to happen? We're going to obey God from the heart. Romans 6, 16 to 18. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are, to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, But you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. Do you want to become a servant of righteousness? Well, of course you do. You certainly don't want to be a slave to sin, do you? Well, of course not. What's the difference? Optimism and obedience. You know, moving forward, and unfortunately we'll end up talking about some of them, David made some terrible, horrible, sinful mistakes in his life, and he paid the price for those things, didn't he? But don't forget and don't overlook the simple principle of David's life. What is the simplest principle of David's life that we could express? He did as God commanded. He did as God commanded. When he didn't do as God commanded, he got in trouble, didn't he? But overall, when we look and think and reflect back upon David's life, he did as he was told. Jesus asked the same thing of each and every one of us. What is it? Do what I tell you to do, and you'll live forever. What must I do to be pleasing to God? Hear the gospel, Romans 10:17. Believe the gospel, John 8:24. Repent of sin, Acts 3:19. Confess Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, Romans 10:9 and 10. Be immersed in water for the remission of sins, 1 Peter 3:21. Then the Lord has added you to His church. You don't have to go join one. He's added you to the one true church. What happens when we sin as Christians? Acts 8:22. Repent therefore this thy wickedness and pray God, if perhaps the thought of thine heart may be forgiven thee. Wherever you are, come now. As together we stand and as we sing the song of encouragement.